These forgotten Betty Crocker recipes may sound impossible, yet they were once proudly served at American tables. Each dish tells a quiet story of its time, shaped by shortages, trends, and the need to make do. Some will feel familiar, others unsettling, but all of them were real meals shared by families who trusted what they were given. This video uncovers 10 lost dishes that slowly disappeared without explanation. Watch closely, because each recipe reveals more than food. It reveals how people once lived, gathered, and remembered. Stay until the end to see which one feels the most impossible today. The chilled mold arrived without warning, carried carefully to the center of the table where conversation often paused. It shimmered under the light, holding suspended vegetables inside a clear, trembling shell. This was tomato aspic, a dish that once signaled effort, pride, and a strange sense of elegance. In mid-century American kitchens, gelatin was more than dessert. It was a symbol of modern cooking, shaped by new products and changing tastes. Cookbooks encouraged creativity, urging homemakers to suspend vegetables, meats, and even seafood in carefully molded forms. Tomato aspic became one of the most recognizable results of that era. It was often served at gatherings, placed proudly beside roasted meats or simple sandwiches. The texture was firm yet delicate, releasing a cold, savory flavor that lingered longer than expected. For many, it felt refined. For others, it remained quietly confusing. What made it remarkable was not just its taste, but its presence. It reflected a time when presentation mattered as much as flavor, when households followed printed guidance with trust and precision. Over time, tastes shifted. Fresh foods replaced preserved experiments, and dishes like tomato aspic slowly vanished from everyday life. Today, it survives mostly in fading pages and distant memories. Yet its image remains unsettling, a quiet reminder of how easily normal can change. What once stood proudly at the center of the table now feels like something almost forgotten, waiting to be understood again by those willing to look closely and remember what it meant to be served without question or doubt in its time period when families gathered quietly and accepted what was placed before them, trusting it belonged there, even when it felt unfamiliar beneath its polished surface, and that quiet acceptance tells its own story today, still lingering here. It began with a pairing that felt ordinary at first glance, yet something about it never quite settled in the mind. A warm plate, a slice of baked ham, and resting beside it, a soft, glazed banana. This was not a mistake. It was a recipe once printed, shared, and trusted. During the 1950s and 1960s, American kitchens embraced combinations that balanced sweet and savory in unexpected ways. Convenience shaped these choices. Canned fruit, pre-cooked meats, and rich sauces allowed meals to be assembled quickly, yet still appear thoughtful. Ham and banana with hollandaise sauce became one of those curious creations. The dish was simple in structure. Bananas were wrapped in slices of ham, then covered in a warm, buttery sauce before being baked. When served, it carried a contrast that was difficult to ignore. The saltiness of the meat met the sweetness of the fruit, softened further by the smooth, heavy texture of the sauce. For some families, it became a memorable dinner, something different from routine meals. For others, it remained a quiet experiment, tried once and never spoken of again. Still, it existed, printed in trusted guides, prepared in real kitchens, and placed before guests without hesitation. What makes this dish linger is not just its unusual pairing, but the confidence behind it. There was no sense of doubt at the time. Recipes like this reflected a period when trying something new felt necessary, even encouraged. Now it feels distant. The idea alone can seem unfamiliar, even unsettling. Yet it stands as proof that what once felt normal can slowly drift into obscurity, leaving behind only a question that remains unanswered long after the plates were cleared and the memory faded quietly from the table where it once belonged. It often appeared at the center of the table, shaped with care, unmoving, almost too perfect to disturb. Guests would glance at it before speaking, as if waiting for someone else to take the first slice. This was the gelatin party mold, a dish that carried both attention and silence. In the middle decades of the 20th century, molded gelatin became a symbol of effort and presentation. Cookbooks encouraged structured designs, layers, and suspended ingredients that turned simple foods into something that looked carefully planned. Vegetables, meats, and even fish were arranged inside clear or lightly tinted gelatin, then chilled until firm. The result was a dish that felt deliberate. Every piece held in place, every detail visible. It was often served at gatherings where appearance mattered as much as taste. The mold stood as a centerpiece, not just food, but a statement of skill and patience. Yet there was always a pause before it was served. The texture, cold and smooth, contrasted with the familiar warmth of other dishes. Each bite carried a quiet uncertainty, something that did not quite match expectations but was accepted without question. For many, it became part of tradition, brought out during holidays or special meals. For others, it remained something admired more than enjoyed. Still, it persisted, supported by trusted instructions and repeated across households. Over time, its presence faded. Changing tastes moved away from rigid forms and preserved textures. The gelatin mold disappeared from most tables, leaving behind only its image. Now, it feels distant, almost unreal. A dish that once held attention now exists as a memory that lingers, not for its flavor, but for the strange stillness it brought to the room before anyone decided to break its perfect shape. It was often served without decoration, placed on the table with a quiet sense of purpose. A firm slice, slightly glossy on top, carrying a smell that filled the room before anyone even sat down. This was liver loaf, a dish that did not try to impress, yet demanded to be accepted. In the years shaped by war and recovery, nothing was meant to be wasted. Organs that once held little value became essential sources of nourishment. Cookbooks of the time presented liver as practical, affordable, and necessary. Ground, mixed with breadcrumbs, spices, and sometimes a light glaze, it was formed into a loaf and baked until dense and steady. The texture was heavy, each slice holding together with a firmness that felt deliberate. The flavor was strong, unmistakable, and not easily softened. Still, it appeared on dinner tables where families gathered, often without complaint. It was not about preference. It was about making use of what was available. For many, it became a familiar part of routine meals. For others, it was something endured quietly, eaten out of respect for effort rather than enjoyment. Yet it remained, supported by guidance that framed it as both sensible and necessary. What lingers now is not just the taste, but the atmosphere around it. A time when meals carried weight beyond flavor, when every ingredient had a purpose that could not be ignored. As abundance slowly returned, dishes like liver loaf began to fade. Choices expanded, and the need for such meals lessened. Today, it feels distant, almost forgotten, yet it stands as a reminder of a period when acceptance mattered more than desire, and what was placed on the table was rarely questioned, even when it left a lasting impression long after the meal ended quietly. It was called a pie, yet nothing about it behaved like one. There were no soft apple slices, no familiar sweetness, no scent of fruit being baked into warmth. Instead, there was a filling made from crackers, carefully transformed into something that only resembled what people expected. During times of shortage and careful budgeting, substitutions became a quiet form of survival. Cookbooks offered solutions that promised comfort without relying on expensive or unavailable ingredients. This is where mock apple pie appeared, built from simple pantry items that could imitate the structure of something far more familiar. Crackers were softened in water, then cooked with sugar, lemon, and spices until they took on a texture that suggested fruit. When baked under a crust, the result looked convincing enough to pass as apple pie from a distance. The illusion was part of its purpose. Families served it during difficult times, often without emphasizing what it truly contained. To many, it was not about deception, but about maintaining a sense of normal life when resources were limited. The familiar shape of a pie brought comfort even when the filling told a different story. What makes it memorable today is not just its ingredients, but the intent behind it. It reflected a time when appearance could temporarily replace reality, and when imagination filled gaps left by necessity. As food supply improved, mock versions like this quietly disappeared from kitchens. Real ingredients returned, and substitutions lost their place in everyday cooking. Yet this pie remains a curious reminder that even the simplest dishes can carry stories of adaptation, patience, and quiet resilience, shaped by circumstances that no longer define how people eat, but still linger in the memory of those who once relied on them. It appeared at gatherings with a confidence that did not match its ingredients. A bowl placed carefully on a table, filled with finely shredded cabbage suspended in a pale, slightly firm mixture. It was called perfection salad, a name that suggested order, precision, and control. At the time, salads were being redefined in American cooking. Influenced by new preservation methods and rising interest in structured presentation, home cooks were encouraged to create dishes that looked refined and consistent. Gelatin became a common tool, allowing vegetables to be set into molded forms that held their shape without change. This salad was built with cabbage, celery, peppers, and sometimes carrots, all suspended in a lemon and vinegar gelatin base. Once chilled, it formed a unified block that could be sliced or served in scoops. The appearance was clean and deliberate, almost architectural in its structure. It was often served at luncheons, tea tables, and family events where presentation mattered deeply. The dish was not meant to surprise, but to impress with its neatness. Each ingredient remained visible, locked in place, as if time had been briefly paused. For some, it represented modern cooking, a step forward from simpler, less structured meals. For others, it was an acquired experience, appreciated more for its novelty than its flavor. Still, it was widely shared, appearing in trusted cookbooks and repeated across households. Over time, changing tastes moved away from rigid salads and gelatin-based dishes. Fresh textures and natural arrangements became preferred, and structured molds slowly disappeared. Today, perfection salad feels like a preserved snapshot of another era, a moment when control over presentation shaped the idea of a meal, leaving behind a dish that now feels distant, yet still carefully remembered in the history of everyday cooking and the quiet ambitions of home kitchens long past. It was the kind of meal that appeared without ceremony yet carried the weight of an entire era. A slice of toast, slightly crisp at the edges, covered in a thick, creamy mixture of chipped beef. Simple, filling, and once deeply familiar in American households. Creamed chipped beef on toast emerged during a time when efficiency mattered as much as taste. Dried beef was inexpensive, easy to store, and could be stretched into multiple meals. Combined with a white sauce made from butter, flour, and milk, it became a dependable dish for families and service members alike. Its roots are often traced back to military kitchens, where it was prepared in large quantities and served quickly. From there, it moved into civilian homes, especially during and after wartime periods when resources were limited and practicality guided cooking decisions. The texture was thick and smooth, coating the toast beneath it. The flavor was salty, rich, and steady, designed more for nourishment than variety. It was not a dish meant to impress. It was meant to sustain. For many, it became a regular part of breakfast or dinner. It was dependable, predictable, and tied to routines that shaped daily life. For others, it was remembered as something heavy, both in taste and in memory, associated with long days and simpler expectations. As food culture changed, fresher and lighter options replaced many of these older staples. The dish gradually faded from common tables, though it never fully disappeared. Now, it remains as a quiet reminder of a time when meals were built from necessity and repetition. A dish that carried people through difficult periods without question, leaving behind a trace of comfort shaped not by luxury, but by survival and consistency that defined everyday life for many families across generations. It looked like dessert from a distance, yet the first bite always revealed something unexpected. A soft casserole, baked until golden on top, releasing a mix of sweetness and sharpness that did not immediately make sense together. This was the pineapple cheese casserole, a dish that reflected a very specific moment in American cooking. During the mid-20th century, convenience foods and canned ingredients reshaped home kitchens. Fruit in cans became common, cheese was widely available, and recipes began to explore combinations that would have once felt unusual. Sweet and savory dishes were no longer separate ideas. They were often placed on the same plate. In this casserole, pineapple was mixed with a simple base, sometimes bread or crackers, then layered with shredded cheese before being baked. The heat softened the fruit, melted the cheese, and created a texture that was both creamy and slightly crisp on top. It often appeared during holiday meals, potlucks, and family gatherings. For some, it was a comforting side dish that added variety to a table filled with traditional foods. For others, it was an unfamiliar pairing that took time to accept. What made it memorable was not just the taste, but the confidence behind it. There was a belief that contrast could create balance, and that unexpected combinations could still belong in a home-cooked meal. Over time, as culinary preferences shifted toward clearer flavor separation, dishes like this began to fade. Fresh ingredients and simpler pairings became more common, and the casserole slowly lost its place in everyday cooking. Today, it stands as a quiet reflection of experimentation in home kitchens, when convenience met creativity and families were willing to trust combinations that no longer feel natural, yet once brought warmth and conversation to the center of the table. It came wrapped, spread, and quietly passed from hand to hand, often without anyone questioning what made it so common. A small portion could stretch across several sandwiches, becoming part of lunches, picnics, and everyday meals. This was deviled ham spread, a simple preparation that once held a firm place in American kitchens. At its core, it was finely processed ham mixed with seasoning, spices, and preservatives that allowed it to last longer and travel easily. In an era when refrigeration was limited and convenience mattered, such spreads offered a practical solution. They could be stored, opened, and used without preparation, making them reliable for busy households. It was often served on bread or crackers, sometimes with pickles or mustard, creating a quick meal that required little effort. For working families, it provided consistency. For children, it became part of lunch routines that rarely changed. What made it notable was not complexity, but repetition. It appeared again and again in lunchboxes, in pantry shelves, and in moments where time was limited. It was food designed for function rather than attention. Over time, as fresh deli options and new refrigerated products became widely available, its presence slowly declined. People began choosing ingredients that felt less processed and more direct, and the spread faded into the background of grocery shelves. Today, it exists more as a memory than a necessity, a reminder of a period when convenience shaped nearly every meal, and when simple preparations carried entire routines on their shoulders. It reflects a time when food was not judged by its creativity, but by how easily it could be shared, stored, and repeated across ordinary days that defined family life in quiet, practical ways that rarely drew attention. It arrived at the table with an unexpected stillness, as if no one was fully ready to explain it. A molded shape, pale and glossy, holding together slices of hot dogs suspended in a firm gelatin base. It was called hot dog aspic, and it stood among the most unusual creations of its time. In the mid-century era of American cooking, gelatin was not limited to desserts. It became a medium for structure, presentation, and experimentation. Anything that could fit was sometimes placed into a mold, then chilled into a unified form. This dish followed that same approach, combining processed meat with a clear, set layer that preserved its shape. It was often prepared for gatherings where novelty mattered. Cookbooks and magazines encouraged creativity, suggesting ways to present familiar ingredients in new forms. The result was a dish that looked precise, almost sculpted, yet carried ingredients everyone already recognized. The texture was cold and firm, releasing flavor slowly rather than immediately. Each slice revealed its internal pattern, a visual reminder of how food could be rearranged without changing its core identity. For some, it represented innovation and curiosity in home cooking. For others, it was a passing experiment, something tried once and never repeated. Yet it existed, documented and served, a reflection of its time. As tastes evolved, such molded dishes gradually disappeared. Fresh preparation and simpler presentation replaced structured forms that required patience and refrigeration. Today, hot dog aspic feels almost unreal, a reminder of how far home cooking once stretched its imagination. It stands as the final example in this journey, closing a chapter of recipes that blurred the line between practicality and experimentation, leaving behind only images of what once sat quietly at the center of the table before fading into history. These forgotten recipes reveal more than unusual ingredients. They reflect a time when American kitchens were shaped by necessity, experimentation, and trust in printed guidance. Each dish carried a purpose, whether it was stretching limited supplies, following modern food trends, or simply creating something new for the table. Over time, tastes changed and these meals quietly disappeared, leaving behind only memories and fading cookbook pages. Yet they remain important reminders of how food history is never static. It evolves with every generation. If you found these stories interesting, subscribe for more forgotten meals and untold history from kitchens long gone.